So we're continuing our series through the kings, okay? And so obviously we already hit Saul, David, and Solomon. Those three kings were over all of Israel. And so 40 years in each one of those reigns. So those are pretty easy to remember. And then we had that split where we had Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that took the northern kingdom. And then we had Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, that took that southern kingdom of Judah. And so right now, we've been going through that northern kingdom. So we got to get all the trash out of the way first right now. Anyway, but obviously, it is all of a lot of kings that did evil in the sight of the Lord. So just to recap, we had, like I said, Saul, David, and Solomon all reigned. They each reigned for 40 years. Then you have Jeroboam that reigned for 22 years. Nadab, his son, reigned for 2 years. Baasha reigned for 24 years. Then Elah, his son, reigned for 2 years. Remember, those were kind of basically mirrored each other, right? Jeroboam sinned a great sin, then all of his seed was going to be cut off, and then that's why Nadab died young, only reigned for 2 years. Same thing with Baasha and Elah, his son. Then Zimri reigned for a whopping 7 days. So Zimri conspired against Elah, killed Elah, and then he ended up burning the house down over top of himself. So that's where Tirzah was taken out, and that's where Omri comes in. Omri reigns for 12 years, 6 years in Tirzah, and then they build the new capital, so to speak, in Samaria, the mountain of Shemer, right? And so Omri reigns for 12 years, and then Ahab, that's what we're getting to now, is Omri's son. So this whole sermon is about King Ahab, okay? So he deserves a whole sermon. So we've been kind of, combining some of these kings because, there's just not a lot said about a king that reigns for 7 days besides the fact that he burns a house over himself. So you got to combine some of these. But with Ahab, there's plenty to talk about. Okay, so Ahab is obviously a very wicked king, but there's actually some very interesting things that you may have not really thought about with Ahab as far as some things that he did. This battle, for example, I kind of went to 1 Kings chapter 20. It's not the first mention of Ahab, but it's an interesting story where God uses Ahab to take out the Syrians. And so we're going to see plenty of stuff that's bad with Ahab. But in that story is one of the most, it's just a really cool saying that he says, and it's from Ahab. And you're like, oh man, why's it got to be Ahab that says it? Because it's such a cool phrase that he uses there. But go back to 1 Kings chapter 16, because I want you to see where Ahab starts out here. And you remember, at the end of Jeroboam's reign, Asa, king of Judah, begins to reign around that time that Jeroboam is basically coming to the end of his reign, and Asa is reigning while Ahab comes into his reign. So Asa reigns while Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, and Ahab are reigning. Obviously, Asa didn't begin when Jeroboam began, and he doesn't go all the way to the end of Ahab, but he's reigning through all those kings. And so that shows you. But Asa also reigns for 41 years. Okay, so obviously he reigns a lot longer. And that's where I want to try to get that chart eventually, if we can get something that looks good, where you see that breakdown, where you have those two lines of kings, and you can kind of see who's reigning with who and all that. That'll just help you when you're reading through the Kings and when you're reading through Chronicles, of knowing who's reigning at that time on the other side of the spectrum. But in 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 24, it says, So Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son reigned in his stead. And in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Ahab the son of Omri to reign over Israel. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel and Samaria 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. So yeah, this is the Ahab we remember. This is the wicked king Ahab, right? Now, like I said, it says here, if it were a light thing. And remember, the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, what was that? Where he made the two calves, he put one in Dan and one in Bethel, and he said, These be thy gods, O Israel, that brought thee out of the land of Egypt. And this is the great sin that Israel's going to be taken out for, is that sin. But it's basically saying, that's kind of light compared to what Ahab does, where he marries this Jezebel. And that's where you get that, you don't want to name your daughter Jezebel, because of this Jezebel. And it's interesting because even in the New Testament it says that thou suffers that woman Jezebel to teach and to serve authority, right? In Revelation. So it's like, it doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you go to, Jezebel's not a good woman, okay? Whether it's in the Old Testament or New Testament. But all that to say is that it mentions that he marries her because she's the one that provokes him and stirs up him to do all this stuff, to Baal and worship Baal. And so you already have all that stuff that those calves are there in the northern kingdom and they're still there and all that stuff. But also add on top of that they have this altar to Baal and this grove that he makes, right? And through the book of, dealing with Ahab, this is where you have the prophet Elijah. Okay, so the prophet Elijah is going on during Ahab's reign. And that's why when you're looking through the Chronicles, you don't see Elijah and Elisha mentioned. Because the kings, the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, are primarily dealing with that northern kingdom. That does mention, obviously, the kings of Judah a lot in there. But when you go to the Chronicles, it's pretty much just mentioning Judah. And it just briefly, it'll mention, like, by the way, Ahab was reigning, or this was going on, or this king was reigning in Israel. But a lot of times you don't see anything mentioned about those kings of Israel. So you say, why aren't we in 2nd Chronicles too? Because they're just not mentioned a lot in there. And so that's why you find Elijah mentioned in 1 Kings and then going into 2 Kings, and then Elisha, because they are the prophets that are in the northern kingdom. And then when you go to the kings of Judah, you'll see these other prophets that are down there. It comes down to this: there's more than one prophet, okay? And even during like Hezekiah's time, there was Isaiah, but then there was the minor prophets. There's other prophets that were around at that time. And so there wasn't just one prophet. And sometimes the prophets were in the northern kingdom, and then sometimes the prophets were in the southern kingdom. So you say, why does that all matter? When you're reading these prophets, you understand why they're talking about what they're talking about. But Elijah is brought up, and this is where Elijah comes on the scene in 1 Kings chapter 17. And so I just want you to see, how Ahab is integral in the stories with Elijah. So first we see that it's during Ahab's reign that Elijah prays for it not to rain for 3.5 years. So in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1 there, it says, And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. And as we know, this is where he prays, earnestly that it should not rain by the space of 3.5 years, or 3 years and 6 months, it says in some places. And so this is during Ahab's reign. Then you go to chapter 18. So chapter 17 at the beginning is basically saying, I'm going to pray that it doesn't rain for these years. And it doesn't say how long yet, but we know from the New Testament and all that stuff that it was 3.5. But notice in 1 Kings chapter 18, in verse 1, it says, And it came to pass, after many days, that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year. Well, what does that mean? In the 3rd year, since he prayed for it not to rain. Okay, so we're in the 3rd year. So that means that when this story takes place, and this is the story of Mount Carmel, when you read the end of the chapter, we're going to see is that rain comes. So what are we dealing? We're in the 3rd year, so we're basically halfway through. We're past the 3rd year, and we're going into 3 years and 6 months, right? But notice it says, Go show thyself unto Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. And Elijah went to show himself unto Ahab, and there was a sore famine in Samaria. So Elijah's not very popular with King Ahab, obviously, because he's praying that it doesn't rain. They've had famine. Because imagine if it doesn't rain for 3 years, your crops aren't going to do well. Unless you're by a river. But even then, if you're by a major river, that could end up drying up pretty bad there. So, but going down the line there, this is where Elijah ends up slaying all the prophets of Baal. Now remember, who brought in the prophets of Baal? Ahab and Jezebel, really. But Jezebel stirred up Ahab to bring in the prophets of Baal. So it's really the religion of Jezebel that's here. But notice in verse 17, and there's a whole story. You can read all these stories. Sake of time, I'd be reading the whole last of 1 Kings if I went through every single portion of the story, dealing with Obadiah and this is a different Obadiah than the book of Obadiah, about how he ends up finding Elijah and shows him to the Ahab and all this stuff. But in verse 17 it says, "And it came to pass, when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said unto him, Art thou he that troubleth Israel?" So notice Ahab's heart. Basically it's famine right now. It's not raining. It's technically because Elijah prayed for it, right? But he's saying, "Art thou he that troubleth Israel?" In verse 18, "And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, and that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Balaam. Now therefore send and gather to me all Israel unto Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal 450, and the prophets of the groves 400, which eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent unto all the children of Israel, and gathered the prophets together unto Mount Carmel. That's interesting. Ahab is just like, "Yes, sir, let's do this." It's just interesting. He's the king of Israel, and you'd think he'd be like off with his head, but obviously God was with Elijah, and God told him to do that. And so obviously Elijah was safe in doing this. But anyway, Ahab's the one that gets all these prophets together. And they come to Mount Carmel, and notice that there's 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the grove. So remember that they worship Baal, but then he also made a grove. So there's 850 of these false prophets that are here at Mount Carmel. And then we see that Elijah kills them all. So basically, you know the story, right? And I preached on this before, dealing with how he says to the prophets of Baal, "You have your sacrifice. Whatever God answers by fire is the true God." And they're cutting themselves, crying out. He's mocking them. He's saying, maybe he's sleeping, cry out. And he goes through this whole thing, and then Elijah dumps water on his 4 barrels 3 times, and then fills up the trough around it, and then obviously God answers by fire and licks up all the water and even takes up the stones with it. And so we know what happens there, but obviously the people they say, "The Lord, He is the God." And they basically, "The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God." In verse 40 there of chapter 18, it says, "And Elijah said unto them, Take the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they took them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slew them there." He just killed all of Ahab's wife's prophets. Okay? Now you could say, well, that just says the prophets of Baal. That's still 450 people. Let's say you cut out the prophets of the grove. I think they're all there. Okay? He brought them all there. Why wouldn't he just take out the prophets of the grove while he's at it? But either way, that's 450 prophets that he killed, but I think it's 850. And then in verse 41 it says, "And Elijah said unto Ahab, Get thee up, and eat and drink, for there is a sound of abundance of rain." So notice, if you never really thought of the story, that it's Elijah the prophet comes on the scene when Ahab starts raining. He makes these groves, and they're worshiping this Baal, and he causes it not to rain for 3 years and 6 months. And after he destroys all the prophets, he's like, "All right, it's time to rain. The showers of blessing are going to come now that we got rid of all these false prophets." So you can kind of think about how this is the cleansing that had to happen. But it says that there's abundance of rain. It says in verse 42, "So Ahab went up to eat and to drink." So notice how he's taking orders from Elijah. I think of Herod, like how he wanted to hear John the Baptist gladly. And he feared the people, and he actually wanted to hear John the Baptist. He ends up killing him, but it wasn't by his own hand that he wanted to kill him, right? It was because he was tricked into it, so to speak, by Herodias' daughter. And you see the same thing a little bit here with King Ahab. And the reason I mention this is because there's going to be some interesting things about Ahab to where you may wonder, is this guy really a reprobate, or is he just married to one? Is he just married to this really wicked... There's no question that Jezebel is a wicked reprobate that is just, basically a demonic person. But the question is Ahab that? Is he one that's without hope? Is he without conscience? Or is Ahab just being basically strung along by this wicked woman, Jezebel, and by his past of his dad? Because we know Omri was really wicked. But Ahab did worse than his father. It says that he was more wicked than all the kings before him, right? So, and I said that about Omri, but Ahab beat him. So Ahab beat his own dad at his game there. But notice as it keeps going on here, I forget where I stopped reading. It says in verse 42 there, it says, "And Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, and he cast himself down upon the earth, and put his face between his knees, and said to his servant, Go up now, look toward the sea. And he went up and looked and said, There is nothing. And he said, Go again 7 times. And it came to pass at the 7th time that he said, Behold, there riseth a little cloud out of the sea like a man's hand. And he said, Go up, say unto Ahab, Prepare thy chariot, and go get thee down, that the rain stop thee not. And it came to pass in the meanwhile that the heaven was black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel, and the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. And the reason I read this story is because you may not have really thought about who was king during that time. You just kind of think, when you think of this story, you just think of Elijah taking out the prophets of Baal. But Ahab is in this story. And he's basically just going along with what Elijah's doing. You don't see Ahab here basically saying, no, off with Elijah's head, even though we know that he provoked the Lord to anger a lot, right? But I kind of view him as a Herod, where there was still hope for Herod, but when he killed John the Baptist, it's like that was the line, and then Jesus wouldn't even speak to him, right? He said, Tell that fox, that I go do many wonderful works. And then when he went to Herod, when they sent him to Herod, he wouldn't even speak to him. So I believe Herod had a chance, and then it was cut off. And Ahab here, I think, still has a conscience. He's dabbling in all this wickedness because of his wife, Jezebel. But this obviously makes Jezebel angry when all her prophets are killed. So verse 1 of chapter 19, and I'm kind of just going through the story of Ahab through here. I'm trying to give you the abridged version of it. But in chapter 19, verse 1 there, it says, And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and with all how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. Notice who keeps trying to kill God's people. It's not Ahab. There's another place where we'll see where Jezebel's the one that's killing the Lord's prophets. And so Ahab had a chance. He could have taken out Elijah when he was there at the Mount Carmel. Obviously, he probably feared the people because they're all for Elijah at that point. But the real culprit here is Jezebel. And that's what I kind of want to show you here, is that when you're looking at Ahab, Ahab was a bad guy, okay? I'm not saying Ahab was saved, okay? I'm not saying he got saved. What I'm saying is that it was the woman Jezebel that was really provoking him to be really evil, to be really bad. And actually, the people, when you see people getting killed or wrongfully, prophets being killed, or as we'll see with Naboth and his vineyard, it's Jezebel that does it. Okay? But in the story that I read, what we read our scripture here, in chapter 20, this is actually an interesting story dealing with Ahab. It's actually a story where Ahab's really kind of the hero. And you say, well, it's King Ahab. Yeah, but in this story, we see Ben-Hadad, the Syrian, the king of Syria, is trying to take out Israel. And God is coming in and stepping in and saying, no, I'm going to take care of this. But I want to first talk about Ben-Hadad is implacable and he's insatiable. Okay? Notice the story here, how it reads. And I don't know if you noticed it. First of all, Ahab's being a little weak at the beginning. Ahab should have been like, get out of my house. Basically, you're not having my wife, you're not having my children. But notice what it says here in verse 1 that says, And Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, gathered all his hosts together, and there were 32 kings with him, and horses and chariots, and he went up and besieged Samaria and warred against it. And he sent messengers to Ahab, king of Israel, into the city, and said unto him, Thus saith Ben-Hadad, Thy silver and thy gold is mine, thy wives and also thy children, even the goodliest are mine. And the king of Israel answered and said, My king, my lord, O king, according to thy saying, I am thine and all that I have. So notice how he's basically bending the knee to Ben-Hadad. But you got to think about this. He has 32 kings with him. This isn't just Syria. He has 32 other kingdoms that are with him, saying basically, this is who's with me. And later on, I'll show you that how many people they had behind them, and it was a force to be reckoned with. And how many they had, and it was not much. Okay, so you can imagine why Ahab would be like, yeah, whatever you want, But notice that when Ahab says, yeah, you can have it, notice what Ben-Hadad says. It says in verse 5 there, it says, and the messengers came again and said, thus speaketh Ben-Hadad, saying, although I have sent unto thee, saying, thou shalt deliver me thy silver and thy gold and thy wives and thy children, yet I will send my servants unto thee tomorrow and about this time, and they shall search thine house and the house of thy servants, and it shall be that whatsoever is pleasant in thine eyes, they shall put in their hand and take it away. So notice how it's basically like you give them a finger, they take a hand, you give them a hand, they take an arm. You ever heard that phrase? Basically, they're not satisfied, they'll never be satisfied. That's what implacable means, is that they are unpacifiable. And insatiable is the same thing. You know, they can't be satiated, can't be satisfied. And so, basically, Ben-Hadad, when you give someone a quick yes, they're going to be like, man, I should ask for more. That's the attitude, right? It's kind of like, in business, you kind of think this too. You know, like we'll give a fee out there, and they'll be like, yeah, sure. We're like, man, I should ask for more, you know, because you're like, I thought that was a big fee. It wasn't as big, you know, they don't blink at it. And when people don't blink at your fee, you're kind of like, man, I should have asked for more, because they didn't even think a second thought of it. And that's where Ben-Hadad's like, oh man, I should have asked for more. We should get more out of this, right? And this is where he tells his all the elders of Israel about what Ben-Hadad says, and they're like, no, what are you doing? You know, it's like he finally brings in all the men around him, and they're basically like, what are you doing? Don't listen to this guy. You can imagine why, when he has hundreds of thousands of troops that can come after him, and you have not even 10,000. And you can imagine why you'd be like, oh man, I need to basically bend the knee to what he says here. But this is where Ahab says one of the coolest quotes in the Bible. One of them, okay? I'm not going to say the coolest quote, but it's one of those quotes that I love. And this is out of the mouth of King Ahab, right? In verse 8 there, it says, and all the elders and all the people said unto him, hearken not unto him, nor consent. Wherefore he said unto the messengers of Ben-Hadad, tell my lord the king, all that thou didst send for to thy servant at the first I will do, but this thing I may not do. And the messengers departed and brought him word again. So you see these messengers going back and forth, kind of going back and forth with these messengers between each other. Back before the telephone, right? You didn't have a telephone where you could just talk back and forth. You had to send messengers. But it says in verse 10 there, it says, and Ben-Hadad sent unto him and said, the gods do so unto me, and more also, if the dust of Samaria shall suffice for handsfuls of all the people that follow me. So he's basically saying that the people that follow me are like the dust of the earth. That's basically what he's saying. That it's like the dust of the earth that's going to come after you. And notice what King Ahab says here. And what's interesting about this is that throughout this passage, it keeps saying the king of Israel, the king of Israel. And sometimes you'll be like, where's Ahab in a lot of these stories? It just says the king of Israel. It doesn't even say his name. But it says here in verse 11, it says, and the king of Israel answered and said, tell him, let not him that girdeth on his harness boast himself as he that putteth it off. And it came to pass when Ben-Hadad heard this message, as he was drinking, he and the kings in the pavilions, that he said unto his servants, set yourselves in array, and they set themselves in array against the city. So what is he saying there? He's basically saying, you haven't even got the fight yet. Don't boast as if you've already taken off your harness, right? Let not him that taketh or girdeth on his harness boast himself as him that taketh it off. Basically, you're boasting as if you've already won this battle. You haven't won it yet. It's just a cool phrase, and how he says it. And it's just basically like, take that, Ben-Hadad. And it makes him so angry, like he's drinking himself drunk, and he hears it. He's, set yourselves in array, go after him, right? And he's basically just getting all his troops ready to go take out Israel. And then God is going to deliver him out of this. And notice that in verse 13, because the thing I want you to see here is that Ahab says this before God says he'll deliver him. Okay? And you think about Omri. Omri was the captain of the host. That was his dad. So I don't think Ahab was a weakling when it comes to battle. And so in verse 13 there it says, and behold, there came a prophet unto Ahab, king of Israel, saying, thus saith the Lord, hast thou seen all this great multitude? Behold, I will deliver it into thine hand this day. And thou shalt know that I am the Lord. And Ahab said, by whom? So he's basically saying, who's going to fight? Right? And he said, thus saith the Lord, even by the young men of the princes of the provinces. Then he said, who shall order the battle? And he answered, thou. So he's basically saying, who's going to fight this battle? He's like, the young men of the princes of the provinces are going to fight it. And he's like, who's going to order the battle? Who's going to basically lead the charge? He says, you are. And notice in verse 15, it tells you the number. It says in verse 15, it says, then he numbered the young men of the princes of the provinces, and there were 232. 232. That's less than Gideon. Gideon had 300. Obviously, that was a low number compared to what he was going after. But notice it says, and after them he numbered all the people, even all the children of Israel, being 7,000. That's not a lot. Okay? Now, I think he's talking about those that are going to battle. I don't think he's just saying 7,000 people are in general, because that wouldn't make any sense, because he says to Elijah that I have left 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. Okay? So, I don't know if these 7,000 are those men, but I'll say this, that there's more than 7,000 people in Israel. Okay? But basically there's 7,000 that are going to make up this army. That's not a lot. And if you think about, like, when the children of Israel came out of the wilderness, they had 600,000 men that were able for war. 600,000. They had 600,000 before they were destroyed in the wilderness, but then when they numbered them again, it was around 600,000 again. 7,000. Now, I know that Judah's not in this number, the southern kingdom. This is the northern kingdom, but that's still Ephraim, Manasseh, and like all those tribes in the north. They had 7,000. But notice that God said it's going to be by the princes, the young men of the princes of the provinces. It's going to be by them that he's going to win this battle, because that's what you do see, is really those 232 men are the one that take this battle. And basically what happens, I'll read it, we've already read it, but these 232 men go into this battle, and they are slaying everyone as man, and they're fleeing, and that's where the 7,000 men come in to basically go after them. So it's kind of like Gideon, right? Or, where they have the 300, where they have the 300, but then other people come in afterwards, and same thing with a lot of stories in the Bible where you have that short number of people or that small number of people, and then everybody's like, oh, let's go in after that. But reading on here, in verse 16, it says, and they went at noon, but Ben-Hadad was drinking himself drunk in the pavilions, and he and the kings, the 32 kings that helped him. So Ben-Hadad is not taking this seriously. But could you imagine? What we're going to see is that when they come the second time, because this is the first time that Ben-Hadad comes after Israel, they're going to come a second time. When they come the second time, they kill 100,000 men of the Syrians. That's how many they killed in battle in one day. One day. So, just to give you an idea, they at least have 100,000 men. Because when they come back the second time, it says, basically, make the army horse for horse, chariot for chariot, man for man. Because they destroy them in this battle. And so what it means here is that when they destroy them, these 232 men and these 7,000 men that are of Israel destroy 100,000 people, at least in the second time, but probably in the first time too. So you imagine that when they said that they had an army that was as the sand of the sea, they weren't lying. It was a big army. And so in verse 16 there, it says, I'm sorry, I was reading, in verse 17, I'm sorry. And the young men of the princes of the provinces went out first, and Ben-Hadad sent out, and they told him, saying, there are men come out of Samaria. And he said, whether they be come out for peace, take them alive, or whether they be come out for war, take them alive. So you imagine that he's not taking it seriously. They're all drinking themselves drunk, all these kings, right? They're not out in the battle. But then they're saying, if these men are coming out, if they're coming out for peace, take them alive, and they come out for war, take them alive. It's basically like, don't kill anybody, just bring them back alive, right? It says in verse 19, it says, so these young men of the princes of the provinces came out of the city, and the army which followed them, and they slew every one his man. And the Syrians fled, and Israel pursued them, and Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, escaped on an horse with the horsemen, and the king of Israel went out and smote the horses and chariots and slew the Syrians with a great slaughter. So they won. And God obviously is the one that brought the victory there. But 300 or 232 people. And if you want to really put it at 7,232 people, right? But honestly, those young men are the ones that went out first, and and then they basically were fleeing at that point, and then that's when the rest of the army came in and started taking out everybody. So basically what happens here is Ben-Hadad, flees away, and then, all these kings are basically saying, listen, that God, he's only the God of the hills. It's because they're in the mountains of West Virginia. No, I'm just kidding. It's because they're in the mountains, and it's because they know how to fight, and they're, it's the God of the hills, and it's like these guys that have multiple gods. There's like a God for everything, right? There's God of the valleys, God of the hills, God of the trees, and all that. So basically, they're saying it was only because it was in the hills and all that stuff. So notice in verse 22 it says, "And the prophet came to the king of Israel and said unto him, Go strengthen thyself and mark and see what thou doest, for at the return of the year the king of Syria will come up against thee." So he's basically saying he's coming back. So strengthen yourself, be ready. He's coming back. And then it goes into this in verse 23. It says, "And the servants of the king of Syria said unto him, Their gods are gods of the hills, therefore they were stronger than we. But let us fight against them in the plain, and surely we shall be stronger than they." So they're basically saying, it's just, their God's just the God of the hills, not of the plain. And and God obviously is going to take them out for that. So, and a lot of this is where God's getting the glory, right? Elijah comes in and purifies that nation a little bit by taking out all those false prophets. And then in this, he's saying, why is God doing this? It says that you may know that I am the Lord. So there's a reason why God is winning this battle. It's not because of Ahab's righteousness. It's not because, I want to help Ahab. It's because he wants Israel to get back on track. He wants Israel to come back to God. And he's showing, obviously, that if you win against hundreds of thousands of troops with 232 people, it was God. And that's why that's why he brought it down to 300. He says, because peradventure, they say it's by our own hand that we won this battle. With 300 against 1,000,000, or whatever it was, it wasn't because of the numbers of men or because of their skill in battle. Okay? But in verse 26 there, it says, "It came to pass at the return of the year that Ben-Hadad numbered the Syrians and went up to Aphek to fight against Israel. And the children of Israel were numbered and were all present and went against them. And the children of Israel pitched before them like two little flocks of kids. But the Syrians filled the country. And there came a man of God and spake unto the king of Israel and said, Thus saith the Lord, because the Syrians have said, The Lord is God of the hills, but he is not God of the valleys. Therefore will I deliver all this great multitude into thine hand, and you shall know that I am the Lord." So basically saying God's going to do it again, what he did before. And notice that it likens the children of Israel to like two little flocks of kids. And the kids are baby goats, right? That's not the technical term, right? A kid is obviously it's basically a little baby goat. So it's basically saying it's like two little flocks of little baby goats is what Israel looks like. And then it says that the Syrians filled the country. So that's what you're looking at. That's your dichotomy of a battle there. And God is saying, I'm going to take them out. And I don't have this in my notes, but I want you to see that when they take them out, because obviously Israel wins this battle, it says in verse 29, it says, "And they pitched one over against the other 7 days, and it was so that in the seventh day the battle was joined, and the children of Israel slew of the Syrians 100,000 footmen in one day." So 100,000 footmen in one day. And then it says, "But the rest fled to Aphek into the city, and there a wall fell upon 27,000 of the men that were left." Think about that, right? It's like out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak, right? If you escape that slaughter of 100,000 footmen, you go back to Aphek. You're fleeing back to Aphek, and a wall falls on you, right? So it's just interesting stuff. I don't know if you ever noticed that in the story, that this wall falls on 27,000 men. So 127,000 men die in this battle at least. Because it says in one day 100,000 men die. It doesn't mean that they were going against them for 7 days. Okay, so I don't know what the total number was, but that's a lot. And I don't think Israel grew from the next year, their army grew that much. And actually it's very clear that it wasn't that big, right? And now, that all sounds good. That's a victory. Ahab, right? Like, man, you applaud Ahab, He's like, let not him that girdeth on his harness boast himself, to him that taketh it off, And you're just like, go Ahab, That doesn't end well because he doesn't end up taking out Ben-Hadad. And he basically saves Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, alive when he should have destroyed him. In verse 32 there, it says, so they girded sackcloth on their loins. And I'm kind of skipping ahead here, but basically they're coming to Ahab wanting to be saved, right, from being put to death. And put ropes on their heads and came to the king of Israel and said, thy servant Ben-Hadad saith, I pray thee, let me live. And he said, is he yet alive? He is my brother. You're like, what are you doing, Ahab? Like, this guy wanted to take out your whole country. He wanted to take your wives, your sons. He wanted to take everything that you have. And he was trying to completely annihilate you. And you're like, you're my brother. Now, listen. Technically, down the line, Laban the Syrian, they are related, if you go that far back. But why are you saying this to a godless nation of Syria, saying, you're my brother? It reminds me of Lot. Nay, do not so wickedly, my brethren. Right? He says that to the people of Lot that are trying to commit sodomy against the two angels. And then you have the same thing in Judges 19. He's saying it to a bunch of sodomites, saying, do not so wickedly, my brethren. Why are you calling him your brother? And why are you saving this man alive? And God condemns him for this. So at the end of the chapter there in verse 42, it says, and he said unto him, thus saith the Lord, because thou hast let go out of thy hand a man whom I appointed to utter destruction, therefore thy life shall go for his life, and thy people for his people. And the king of Israel went to his house heavy and displeased, and came to Samaria. Now, the reason that I say, like I said, I think he has a conscience still. I don't think that Ahab's past feeling, or he's basically a pharaoh that's been hardened to the point where there's no hope for him. Because he's heavy and displeased, basically he has a conscience about what's going on here. He realizes that he did wrong, and he's not happy about the condemnation that's coming down on him. But obviously, it's kind of like Saul. Remember, Saul didn't take out all the Amalekites. He left the king alive, and the kingdom was taken away from him because of that. Okay, so it's kind of history repeating itself a little bit there. But then we get into Naboth the Jezreelite. So in chapter 21, now I'm kind of just going through a tour de force from chapter 16 to the end of the book here of what's going on with Ahab, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And this is a famous story dealing with how Ahab wanted that vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. I always want to call him Nabal, but that's a different person. but Naboth the Jezreelite is a man that has a vineyard, and this is where Ahab starts kicking and screaming like a little boy. If you ever read this story, you're just like, he's pouting. He's pouting. He's like stomping his feet. He's like, I wanted the vineyard. You didn't want to give it to me. That's when I read this. That's what I get out of it. But again, what we'll see here is that Ahab's not the one that pulls the trigger and does anything really evil here. It's Jezebel. So in verse 1 there, it says, and it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard which was in Jezreel, hard by the palace of Ahab king of Samaria. And Ahab spake unto Naboth, saying, give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house, and I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it, or if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money. And Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid it me, that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee. And Ahab came into his house heavy and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him, for he had said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. And he laid him down upon his bed and turned away his face and would not eat bread. I don't know. I just laugh at this, okay? This is hilarious to me, right? Basically, he didn't get what he wanted. And he goes and just pouts and won't eat. And he's just laying in his bed, right? And, you can understand why Naboth didn't want to give it. There's certain things that are not worth the money, right? Certain things that have been handed down. You can think of like... what's the word for things that are given in a family? An heirloom, right? A family heirloom is something that's like handed down. It's like a ring or something that's like given down from grandfather to grandfather. And you're like, I don't care how much money you give me, I'm not going to give it away. This has been my family for years. So it's not like this vineyard was just that nice. It's just the fact that this guy, it was given to him by his fathers. It's been handed down from generation to generation. He's like, I just don't want to give it up. I don't care if you give me a better one. And so Ahab goes home and pouts. Okay, so this is where his wife comes in. So at this point, did Ahab really do anything wrong? He didn't go over and say, I'm going to declare eminent domain. I'm the king. That place is mine, and I'm going to give you whatever I think it's worth. That's our government. Okay, actually, our government's worse than King Ahab when it comes to eminent domain and property rights here. Jezebel is really what our government's kind of like, right? Well, if you're not going to give it, I'm going to kill you, and we're going to suicide you because you know something about the Clintons or something. By the way, I know nothing about the Clintons. I'm just putting that out there, So if you find a gunshot wound and I'm alone somewhere, it was not me. Anyway, so it's funny, but it's true, right? What's going on in the world. But all that to say is that Jezebel right here is the one that really kicks this up, and she's the one that's nefarious on this. Now, that doesn't mean that Ahab's not going to get blamed for it, because you're responsible for your wife. And men, if you want to have the authority and you're the boss at home, that means that everything that your wife does is on you. Right. So you got to take the good with the bad, right? So if you're going to be the man in the house, and you're going to wear the pants, then you better be able to take all the stuff that goes with it. And so, anyway, all that to say is that he's going to suffer for the consequences of what his wife does. And in verse 5 there it says, But Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said unto him, Why is thy spirit so sad, that thou eatest no bread? And he said unto her, Because I spake unto Naboth the Jezreelite, and said unto him, Give me thy vineyard for money, or else, if it please thee, I will give thee another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give thee my vineyard. So he's just pouting. I just imagine him kicking his feet, like, you won't give me my vineyard. I want the vineyard. It's next to my house. And then it says in verse 7, it says, And Jezebel, his wife, said unto him, Dost thou now govern the kingdom of Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let thine heart be merry. I will give thee the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she basically pats him on the head, gives him a little bit of warm milk, and tells him that, take a little nap. I'll take care of this. Right? And so, Ahab has nothing to do, technically, with Naboth being killed. And I'm not going to go through the whole story, but you know what happens, right? She says, Go find 2 sons of Belial. Well, let me ask you this. How do you know they're sons of Belial? Right? Well, from Judges chapter 19, they're a bunch of sodomites. And she knows that sons of Belial are a bunch of liars that bear false witness. So she basically says, Go find 2 sons of Belial and bring this Naboth up, and then have them lie and say that he blasphemed against God, so that they stone him to death. Okay, so basically she's going to have Naboth killed. What she does, though, is she sends out letters with the seal of Ahab. So basically, when the people get this letter, they think it's Ahab that's writing it. Does that make sense? It's basically, and she basically is doing this in the name of Ahab. And so basically what happens is that, they end up killing Naboth, and then Naboth, basically Ahab just goes into the vineyard. He's basically like, oh, great. He wakes up from his little nap, from his little warm milk and cod liver oil that he was given after, his little pout session. And he's like, oh, Naboth's dead? All right, I'm going to go take my vineyard now. And so he just acts like a little kid here. And that maybe that's not the way you read it, but that's the way I read it. He's just like a little child here wanting his vineyard. But I feel like I missed a spot here. Yeah, no, actually. I'm just trying to skip through some of this stuff because it just takes too long to get through it all. But in verse 17 there, Ahab's going to be condemned for this. And, it's rightfully so. It's kind of like David. David didn't actually kill Uriah, right? The sword of Ahab did. Remember, they had Uriah. He says, put him out into the heat of the battle and then move everybody back. Well, you suicided him is what you did. And so basically, and who was blamed for the death of Uriah? Was it Joab? Because he was the one that was leading that charge and gave the order. No, it was King David. He said, thou hast killed Uriah with the sword of Ammon. So Ahab is going to be taking the blame for this. In verse 17 it says, And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, which is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, whither he has gone down to possess it. So he's already in his vineyard, right? And it says in verse 19, and thou shalt speak unto him, saying, thus saith the Lord, hast thou killed and also taken possession? And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, thus saith the Lord, in the place where dogs lick the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick thy blood, even thine. And so notice that he's basically saying, where Naboth was, and where the dogs licked his blood, they're going to lick your blood. And notice what it says in verse 20. It says, and Ahab said to Elijah, hast thou found me, O mine enemy? And he answered, I have found thee, because thou hast sold thyself to work evil in the sight of the Lord. So notice that in verse 17 to 19, this is God telling Elijah what to tell him, right? So when we see verse 20, Ahab hasn't received the condemnation yet. I want you to see that because we're going to see that Ahab's actually going to humble himself and ask, basically, he's going to humble himself before the Lord. So but at this point, he hasn't heard that condemnation. So he's basically saying, Elijah comes down and he's like, all right, here's my enemy, Elijah. But notice what it says in verse 21. It says, behold, I will bring evil upon thee, and will take away thy posterity, and will cut off from Ahab him that pisseth against the wall, and him that is shut up and left in Israel, and will make thine house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah, for the provocation wherewith thou hast provoked me to anger, and made Israel to sin. And of Jezebel also spake the Lord, saying, the dogs shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. Him that dieth of Ahab in the city, the dogs shall eat. And him that dieth in the field shall the fowls of the air eat. So he's getting the same condemnation that Jeroboam got and Baasha got. Notice that it even says that, right? You're going to be like the house of Jeroboam and like the house of Baasha. And what happened to both those houses? They were completely taken out. And what's going to happen with this is that Jehu, the son of Nimshi, is going to be anointed to be king over Israel, and he's going to take out all of Ahab's house. So Ahab's going to die. I'm going to show you where he dies. Not by Jehu, but all of Ahab's house, all of his posterity, that's his seed, his generations that come after him, are all going to be completely annihilated by Jehu. And that's the story, which I haven't got the spoiler alert, but they're going to throw Jezebel down the wall, and the dogs are going to eat her. Because remember, they go in and they start eating. They're like, well, we need to bury her. She's a king's daughter. They go out there and all they find is her skull and the palms of her hands. And we'll get to that story when we get a little further when we get to Jehu, okay? But just to give you a little enticement and when you're like, I need to be here for Jehu's story, right? But notice in verse 25, and this is what's interesting about Ahab. Because I want you to see that he's not just this one-dimensional, evil out to just destroy God's people. What we see actually is that it's Jezebel that's after God's people. She's trying to kill all the prophets. Obadiah hides a lot of them from Jezebel. And then Jezebel's the one that's trying to kill Elijah. And then Jezebel's the one that takes out Naboth. Notice it's Jezebel in all this. That doesn't mean that Ahab's getting out of it. He's getting condemnation for it. But notice that it wasn't Ahab that was doing all this. And that's when you get down to verse 25. Verse 25 it says, but there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. Now there's a summing up of who Ahab is. He sold himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, and Jezebel's the one that stirred it up out of him. Basically, this woman was his downfall. This woman was the one that destroyed him and caused him to do all this wickedness. This happened to Solomon at the end of his life. Solomon had a bunch of strange wives, and they turned his heart from the Lord to make all these groves and all these altars to these false gods. And Jezebel is one of the most wicked women in the Bible when it comes to this. Verse 26, it says, and he did very abominably in following idols according to all things as did the Amorites, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. So in verse 25 through 26, it's kind of giving a sum up of who Ahab is. But notice in verse 27, this is after he hears this condemnation that's given to him, after Naboth was killed, and God's saying basically all your house is going to be taken out. Verse 27, and it came to pass, when Ahab heard those words, that he rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his flesh, and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went softly. So he was, weeping and, he was remorseful. I'm not saying he got saved here, okay? I'm not saying this is like where he believed on the Lord and got saved or anything like that. But what I'm saying is that, what this shows me is that he's not without conscience. And a lot of this stuff is because his wife Jezebel was stirring him up to do it. And notice what it says in verse 28. It says, "And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Seest thou how Ahab humbleth himself before me? Because he humbleth himself before me, I will not bring the evil in his days, but in his son's days will I bring the evil upon his house." So he's basically saying, okay, because he humbles himself, all this stuff that I'm pronouncing against him is going to happen in his son's day. So he's not going to see it, right? He's not going to see all his posterity taken out. It's kind of like Zedekiah. I was saying, before I put out your eyes, Zedekiah, you're going to see all your sons die before your face. So that's kind of the idea. He's letting him die before that happens. Okay, so that's his mercy that he gives him there. And you say, well, is Ahab, is he a hater of God, and all this stuff? I don't know. Okay, what I'm saying here, because Judas repented. Okay, I'm just being honest with you. Judas, who was a devil, the son of perdition, repented and went and said, I have betrayed the innocent blood. So is it possible for some reprobate that hates God, like Judas, to basically... But here's the thing, what is the remorse for? I think Judas was remorseful because of, his position. There's probably nefarious reasons of why he was remorseful, right? Because people could be remorseful because they got caught. It's like, oh, I'm sorry because I got caught. Are they really sorry because they did it or because of the consequences that come with it? And you could say maybe that's the case with Ahab. And here's my reason why it could be that maybe he is just, a hater of God and God's just kind of showing mercy here. But it's because in 2 Chronicles 19:2, when it says, shouldest thou help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord, he's talking about how he helped out Israel. And it was Ahab that he helped out. Now, you could say, well, maybe it's because Jezebel's the one that was really wearing the pants in that family, and Jezebel's kind of the lead to all this stuff that's going on, and that's who's hating the Lord. It doesn't say that Ahab hated the Lord, but that's where I would maybe say, well, I'm not 100% sure. But to me, when I look at him humbling himself, I see Manasseh in this picture too. When we get to the king Manasseh, who is a very wicked king, he actually sacrificed his own son. He humbles himself to God. Okay? And all I'm saying is that Ahab, there's a little more to Ahab than maybe you thought. When you think of King Ahab, you think of this wicked king that was against Elijah and all these things about King Ahab. But when you really read it, who's really the big bad guy you see here? Jezebel. And Ahab's getting strung along by this woman, and basically it's his downfall, and he's having to suffer the consequences for allowing it to happen. But Ahab dies, and so I want you to see this is how he ends here. Basically, there's this battle with Ramoth-Gilead. So this is where Jehoshaphat, he brings in Jehoshaphat. So there's Ramoth-Gilead is kind of in the north, and the Syrians had taken it out and all this stuff. So after he wins all these battles with Syria, he's like, basically, I want Ramoth-Gilead back. And he brings in Jehoshaphat and says, hey, come with me. And this is where Jehoshaphat says, I'm as you are, my people is thy people. We're brethren. And that's where he gets rebuked later on, saying, shouldest thou help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? Therefore wrath is upon thee from before the Lord. So remember, Jehu, the son of Hanani, the prophet, comes to Jehoshaphat and rebukes him for going to help the king of Israel. Okay, so he shouldn't have done it. But this is the story with Micaiah, right? Remember the prophets are like, go up, you'll get it, God's going to, give you that land, or give you that, basically you're going to win the battle. And then Jehoshaphat's there, and he's saying, is there not anyone, there's like 400 of these guys. It's like, there's no one else. Because you can see that Jehoshaphat saw right through these false prophets, that they're just giving King Ahab lip service. They're just the yes men, right? Like, whatever you want to do, we're for it. We're going to say God's with you on that. He says, there's no one else, and that's where they're like, well, there's Micaiah, but I hate him because he never prophesies good concerning me. And so there's that whole story. So if you want to see that story, you're going to have to read it in your own time because we don't have no time for it. But that's where Micaiah comes in and says, basically, hey, I saw the Lord, with all the hosts around him, and, I saw Israel with a sheep having no shepherd. That prophesies that Ahab's going to be killed in this battle. And that's what happens, okay? And so Ahab, is going to be wounded and actually die. And I just want to kind of get you to that point. If you want to read the story of that battle and Jehoshaphat and all that that's going on, you can read that, in your own time. But we might get to that story, when we get to Jehoshaphat, when we get to the kings of Judah. But in verse 34 there, in 1 Kings chapter 22 and verse 34, it says, "And a certain man drew a bow at a venture, and smote the king of Israel between the joints of the harness. Wherefore he said unto the driver of his harness, Turn thine hand, and carry me out of the host, for I am wounded." I can't remember if I said which chapter. It's 22 and verse 35 there. "And the battle increased that day, and the king was stayed up in his chariot against the Syrians, and died at even. And the blood ran out of the wound into the midst of the chariot." Okay, so there's where the prophecy is going to come true. So basically he's in battle. He gets hit with a bow, or with an arrow, right? And he's like, "Take me away from the battle." And he's bleeding, and that blood's in the chariot, right? And it goes on, it says, "And there went a proclamation throughout the host about the going down of the sun, saying, Every man to his city, and every man to his own country." So that's where the sheep, having no shepherd, they're all going back to their homes. That's what was prophesied by Micaiah. And so Ahab dies there in that chariot. And it says in verse 37, "So the king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried the king in Samaria." Notice this in verse 38. "And one washed the chariot in the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood. And they washed his armor according unto the word of the Lord which he spake." And so there's where that prophecy is. Remember, what did it say about Ahab? The dogs are going to lick the blood where they licked the blood of Naboth. And where did they kill him? Right, same place. So basically what happened was they buried the king, and then they go wash the chariot, and all that blood's coming off the chariot, and the dogs are licking up that blood. And so there's where the prophecy came true, that they were going to lick up his blood in the same spot where they licked up the blood of Naboth. And verse 39 there says, "Now the rest of the acts of Ahab and all that he did, and the ivory house which he made, and all the cities that he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Ahab slept with his fathers, and Ahaziah his son reigned in his stead." And so, like I said, what's interesting sometimes when you get to the end here, where it's like, the rest of the acts of such and such a king, is it gives you like this little nugget of like, oh, by the way, he built this ivory house, right? I always like those little nuggets, and it's kind of like little information, and they'll give you like little things like he did this or he did that. But you know that he built an ivory house now. But all that to say is that King Ahab's an interesting character. Like I said, by and large, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He provoked the Lord more than any other kings before him. So I'm not saying that Ahab's a good guy, okay? Don't get that across there. What I'm saying is there's a little more to Ahab than what you maybe thought. That he actually fought this great battle against the Syrians twice and won with God's help, obviously. But, he's basically a man of war there where he fought that battle. So that's kind of a cool little story with Ahab there. But then even after that whole thing with Naboth, he repented. He humbled himself. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not saying he got saved there. But it makes me wonder whether he's like this wicked reprobate that maybe you thought he was. It's kind of like Nebuchadnezzar. When you look at Nebuchadnezzar, you're thinking King Nebuchadnezzar, he is the poster child of the Antichrist. It's like, yes, he is, in the sense that he looks like him, but he also humbled himself in Daniel chapter 4 and was giving praise to the God of heaven. I think Nebuchadnezzar is in heaven right now. But you may not think that on the surface when you're looking at it until you look a little deeper. Same with Manasseh. Manasseh killed his own son, but when you look at his prayer that he prayed to God, you wonder, did he get saved there? And I'm just throwing it out because a lot of the times you don't really know for sure. David was a man after God's own heart. You know that he's going to be in the house of the Lord forever. There's certain people that are in heaven. But some of these kings, it makes you wonder, if they got right. Because here's the thing. Can a saved person do wicked things? Of course. We still had the flesh. So, Solomon did some really crazy things at the end of his life. But would you say Solomon's not saved? Right? I don't think anybody would say Solomon's not saved, and he had like all these altars to other gods and all this other stuff. I'm not condoning any of that, but what I'm saying is that, sometimes when you're reading through these kings, sometimes you just need to maybe step back and take out those preconceived ideas, because sometimes when you're reading through it, you think, well, he killed Naboth, and he was trying to kill all the prophets. It's like, wait a minute, did he do it, or was it Jezebel? And you kind of see that he was actually really just this weak man that was behind a woman, right? So I'm not a fan of Ahab. I want you to get that. I'm not a fan of Ahab, but what I'm saying is that sometimes you may have to step back and really read into it and say, okay, well, what was causing all this? And so anyway, I hope that helps out. Like I said, just to recap, with the kings, we have Saul, David, Solomon, that reigned over all of Israel, each of them for 40 years. Then we had that split, and that northern kingdom of Israel that took most of the tribes with them, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, that made Israel to sin, that we keep hearing over and over again. He reigned for 22 years. His son Nadab reigned for 2 years. Then Baasha had him killed, and then 24 years Baasha reigned. And then Elah reigned for 2 years, his son. And then Zimri takes him out. Zimri burns the house down over him, and he only reigns for 7 days. Omri, the captain of the host, takes over for 12 years. And then Ahab, his son, reigns for 22 years. So that's where we're at right now. So try to remember these. Try to go through these and remember this order. Because one of the reasons why I'm doing this and going through this is to help you remember these kings. Because I'm just going to be honest with you, when you get past Jeroboam and Rehoboam, it gets a little foggy on who's after who and where you're at in those lines. So hopefully this helps you remember that. So let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for today. Thank you for the souls that were saved, and just pray that you be with us as we go out throughout this week with our jobs, and just pray that you would bless the fellowship that we have. And Lord, we thank you for obviously eternal life, and Lord, knowing that we're saved. And we just pray that you would help us to understand these passages and to glean everything we can. And Lord, even with these bad examples of these kings, Lord, we can learn from their bad example of what not to do. And Lord, just pray that you would help us to use it for your glory. And we love you and pray also in Jesus Christ's name.